Okay, so this research interview video is for the thesis researcher Ibn Alif Dafa Gymnastier with the title United States Strategy in Facing China's Grey Zone Tactics to Achieve Regional Security in the South China Sea. I'll give consent for the video to be used for the research purposes only. So I'll go ahead and explore the questions. So the first question is, what is your opinion on the growing influence of China in the Indo-Pacific regional area? I think that it's quite a big question. The influence has been tremendous over the past, I think, I would say 2 decades. So the idea here is that China's growth in the economic sector has led to its exertion of power in other areas, for example, in politics, security, and economics. And I think that a lot of Southeast Asian region, which is central to the Indo-Pacific area, has become very much close and appeasement policies towards China. As we see, because the question is, let's say for example in the security domain where I focus my expertise at. So I think that China's domains and also the exertion of influence in the Indo-Pacific can be seen in the South China Sea, for example, has been through the attempted bullying of Southeast Asian states in the ways that there's a lot of the 9-line, for example, which has been updated to 10-line, incorporating Taiwan, incorporates a lot of the areas that overlap with Southeast Asian maritime zones. Now the problem with that eventually is that these maritime zones have been recognized by, for example, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but China shows disregard towards those international laws and instruments. Therefore, Southeast Asian states are the one that kind of like gets the victim position. So that is because Southeast Asia is central to the Indo-Pacific region. I wouldn't say that China has like a growing influence in means that they have a grand strategy of whatnot to take the Southeast Asian region. But for example, in maritime borders, as well as things such as security aspects, that is one of the main concerns when it comes to China's growing influence. I think that the other growing influence to the broader areas where you would, for example, incorporate the littoral states of Pacific, like Pacific, I would say, for example, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, is in addition to Southeast Asia, is the Belt Road Initiative, and I think that since 2013, if I'm not mistaken, the initiative has expanded a lot. And the problem with this is that from an academics perspective, there's been a lot of talk about predatory lending practices, meaning that the BRI itself is such a lucrative foreign investment opportunity for the smaller and secondary states of Southeast Asia and also other littoral states of the Indo-Pacific, that they kind of like receive all of these foreign investments without thinking about the repercussions. Are they able to return the investments in the specific and determined time period, which in several of the cases has not, and that has a lot of bad impacts for those secondary states in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that the growing influence for me, it's a plus and minus. So it's a plus and minus. I can't say that, for example, it's a bad thing or a good thing, because in one way the BRI provides all of these different type of opportunities, economic opportunities for Indo-Pacific states, but at the same time, these states are in the capability and the capacity to return most of the foreign investments. Therefore, why, for example, me being an academic, I see it from the perspective of how other academics see it, would be the idea of predatory lending practices being prevalent in the context of the Indo-Pacific and also the Belt Road Initiative. And of course, this isn't only in the Indo-Pacific. There's also other regions that incorporates the Belt Road Initiative that kind of like falls into this category. Okay, second question. In the sub-region of the Indo-Pacific, namely South China Sea, China claims the 9-line based on historical principles. What is your view on this? I don't agree with it. Like, for example, to a certain extent. Not to a certain, but I ultimately don't agree with it. But eventually, as an academic's perspective, that doesn't really make any difference. So the perspective of China is that the 9-line is their historical rights, and you need to ask a historian to really understand whether it falls under their respective sovereign claims based on those traditional fishing rights. But from what I see, based on the UNCLOS does not recognize traditional fishing grounds. It has to be a legitimate 200 nautical miles for exclusive economic zones and whatnot. So eventually, from what I see is that China is trying to enforce their maritime sovereignty in areas that is now known as gray zone because, overlapping claims between Southeast Asian states and also China itself. So it's a problem because, in one side you have Southeast Asian states like, for example, Vietnam, Philippines, and also Brunei and Malaysia. They have a legitimate claim in the South China Sea, and they have, UNCLOS to back it, and China does not. So which one is right and which one is wrong? Of course, the Southeast Asian states are right because they have UNCLOS as their backing. If we are to take the perspective that international law matters and actually should be considered when it comes to the idea of, South China Sea. But in the reality is that, China disregards those types of assumptions, and they have proceeded to be present in those seas. So when I say being present is, using their coast guards, not necessarily the PLAN's navies, but coast guard survey ships, fishing militia. And I think that the maritime diplomacy literature, which I have also written a couple of articles on, makes and highlights these issues very well. And it shows that, the dangers of China's maritime zone claims in the South China Sea is not that it's going to be militarized, but because of effective occupancy. Now, starting from land reclamations, like making lands out of nothing, like rocks and small pieces of islands, creating like strips of facilities in South China Sea. So all of these are the consequences of China's claims. So I think that the problem with that is not the debate about legitimacy or legal aspect of it, but the consequences of it, because China has already embraced that the nine-dash line is theirs, and it's their legitimate claims, and as a consequence, they are present in those areas. So the term for that is maritime power projection. So, even though they don't have the backing of UNCLOS, they also lost to the Philippines in 2016's arbitral tribunal. It doesn't really matter for them. What matters for them is that, their claims is they have this piece of island and they can use it as much as they want. And that's why we see, for example, they start doing oil and drilling of oil and gas explorations in the South China Sea, being present in those seas. So of course it's an unfortunate situation, but it's something that, happens because of the status of China as a great power. And if we connect it to the first question of, exertion of influence of China with the BRI and the capacity disparity between Southeast Asian states and the Indo-Pacific states compared to China, of course, you kind of have your way of doing things, a bullying type of thing. So I think like academics like Mearsheimer has predicted this, the China's rise won't be able to be countered by the smaller states, and eventually because the US is so distant away, they can't really technically do anything if, for example, China bullies, their Southeast Asian counterparts, which has been always the case in those seas. All right, third question. To maintain the sovereignty of nine-dash line, China has carried out gray zone efforts around key islands, such as building artificial islands in China's Coast Guard. What is your response to China's gray zone tactics in the South China Sea? It's an intelligent one, I would say, because with gray zone, I think that the term that you need to highlight here is the gray zone. A gray zone is there is a lack of definite international law that is applied in those particular cases, because what is happening is in the South China Sea is that you see coast guards ramming each other. You see, illegal fishing boats being stopped by coast guards, by fisheries surveillance vessels and whatnot. So these are instances, for example, when you have one coast guard ramming into another coast guard of another state, these instances are not in the category of warfare. So you can't really invoke, the Geneva Conventions and whatnot, because those are not instances of war. And that's why they call it gray zone activities, because the gray zone activity is just to show that in the context of South China Sea and in for example, using maritime diplomacy's framework, those instances are just to show that I own these seas, and what, asking them, the Southeast Asian states, what are you doing here? This is my maritime zone, you have to get out. If you don't, then I'm going to have my coast guards, circulating around your fishermen, circulating around your operating zones. And there's been a lot of instances like this. Chinese coast guards have been massive, I think that there's a lot of reports like from the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative that said that coast guards present in the overlapping claims between China as well as the Philippines and Vietnam has been near daily. So that means around 300 more days, 300 plus days, sorry, in the South China Sea in the overlapping areas, right? So that's a big concern because that means that China's coast guards are disregarding the other Southeast Asian states' claims, and they're just being operative, being effectively present in those contested waters. So eventually that's a problem, which of course I also see it as a problem, but there's not much that can be done because of that gray zone area. So even though there's always clear definition by the UNCLOS that this is not owned by China, and I think that the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal has also claimed that the 9-line claim is not in alignment to international law, that's not important. I think that's not important. What's important is what China does in the South China Sea, which of course is the exertion of their influence, being present using coast guards, survey ships, fishing militia, and all of these different types of maritime constabulary forces. So of course it's something that has happened, and it can't be really much countered by Southeast Asian states, other claimant states. You can't really do anything. The only response has been to mimic strategies. So for example, when the PLAN and Chinese government eventually decided to proliferate the presence of these coast guards, several Southeast Asian states like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines started to build their own coast guards. For example, even though a non-claimant state, Indonesia also has a big stake in the Natuna, for example, because it slightly overlaps with China's 10-line. So in the Natuna, you can see that there's a heavy presence of Chinese coast guards. So Jokowi's solution that time was to make sure that Indonesia has a strong coast guard in the form of the Indonesian Maritime Security Agency, or as Bakamla, right? So that's why enforcing Bakamla was a solution, and that has also been a solution for other Southeast Asian states to counter the grey zone tactics, because we're not using military navies here, so it's not the traditional paragunboat naval diplomacy that we know during the World War II and whatnot. It's more contemporary, it's more indirect, it's more civilian, because coast guards aren't military assets, they're civilian assets. So that's why you see a lot of these presence in the South China Sea, and it is true that it is a grey zone tactic, but it's something that it's hard to counter because the lack of regulations and laws that can regulate those instances. Because these are very limited skirmishes. There's no use of fire weaponry. These are weaponry are only used for firing warning shots. Firing warning shots and whatnot. So it's not really that serious, but eventually it disturbs a lot of the Southeast Asian states, as we can see in a lot of the mass media coverage as of late. So number 4, China's grey zone tactics have prompted various reactions from neighboring countries, including Southeast Asian countries. How do you interpret the inter-country dynamics in this region? It really depends on what inter-country dynamic. If we're talking about ASEAN, for example, I think that neighbors in ASEAN against China, it's hard to do anything, for example, in the context of ASEAN, because they don't have the institutional capacity to tame a country like China. So what they can do is kind of like introduce peaceful norms. So that's what they did in the declaration in 2002. And now they're trying to force upon a code of conduct, which has been difficult, which has been in negotiation actually for 2 decades, 20 more years. So I don't perceive that they have the capacity to actually, manage the tensions in the South China Sea. Now, what we see with other Southeast Asian countries, it really much depends on which category of countries that we're talking about. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, it's such a diverse country. So you have, for example, in regards to South China Sea, you have countries that have a claimant state, you have a non-claimant state. Claimant states like Vietnam and the Philippines have been, very, very vocal against China, especially with the Philippines. After Duterte in 2022, I think now is Bongbong Marcos, something like that, Marcos. Marcos has been very strong in his rhetoric to be against China's South China Sea claim. He has tried to tighten the relations with the U.S. Through the Mutual Defense Treaty, which shows, for example, that Philippines has a backing of the U.S. when it comes to potential proliferation of the problem later on in the future, if that happens. So Philippines, Vietnam as claimant states, clear claimant states, yes. But you also have, a little bit of a vague category. Like, for example, Indonesia. Indonesia is a non-claimant state, and they don't acknowledge that there is a claimant, a maritime border problem with China. They never did in Jokowi. A little bit in Prabowo, but nevertheless still remains the same, that they don't acknowledge a problem. But scholars have, kind of like interpreted Indonesia and a couple of other states as hedging policies. I think that's a term that should be investigated further in the study. So hedging kind of like adopts defiance and deference measures when it comes to China. So sometimes in certain circumstances, for example, in economic relations, they would be close to China. But when it comes to military affairs, they would be close to the Western states. And I think that a lot of the Southeast Asian states are doing that because, they can't say that China is an enemy because of the lucrative economic investments that China is able to offer to Southeast Asian states. So that's what we see, I think, in several of the other non-claimant states in mainland Southeast Asia, for example, Cambodia and Laos, where there have been a little bit of a leaning towards China because they have nothing at stake at the seas. What they see from their perspective is that, China has been such a strong ally when it comes to economic development and also infrastructure building in their country. So, for example, there was a famous case in 2012 where Cambodia's chairmanship in ASEAN, because they were so close to China, they refrained from mentioning South China Sea problem in the joint communique, and that was the first time that ASEAN was not able to issue a joint communique. So, of course, there are problems. There are problems in the unity of Southeast Asian states in regards to the South China Sea, and I think that the best way to categorize this is, the traditional alignment framework. For example, some are balancing, some are bandwagoning, and some are also in between those two categories, which is hedging. So I think those are the concepts that could be explored even deeper. In 2022, the United States released a policy document titled Indo-Pacific Strategy of the US. The document emphasized a commitment to safeguarding regional security with allies against threats in South China through 5 main pillars. What is your view on the US security strategy, especially in relation to China's gray zone influence within the 9-dash line? Not much. I don't perceive that the US has been that present in the context of the Indo-Pacific. So, and I look at it in the perspective of literal presence. So, the South China Sea is such a distant water compared to, for example, the areas of the US. So they can't really maintain a heavy active presence in the South China Sea as much as China. I mean, they can be like operating in their claims of international waters, and they can introduce these rhetorics, these grand strategies, like the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US that you said in the fifth question. Well, it's not really new. Like they already did this in the US pivot to Asia back in Hillary Clinton and Obama's terms. So the idea of the US returning back and being active in the Asia Pacific, which is now the Indo-Pacific, has been like a rhetoric that has been introduced since a long time ago. But unfortunately, from my perspective, is that there's not much of a foreign policy consequence of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, besides strengthening their alliances in the Pacific. So that would include, for example, strengthening with the India in the Indian portion, and also in the Pacific portion, you would say, arguably, for example, Japan, the Philippines. Now, maintaining these presence and increasing, for example, making joint military exercises, I think those are the only things that the US can actually do. But because it's such distant waters, in my perspective, the US won't be able to exert that much influence in the South China Sea issue. They can only tackle the problem from a normative level, saying that, it's injustice, what they're doing in the gray zone areas, what they're doing is against international law, But, these rhetorics, you can always debate the significance of it, which in my perspective, the norms that they try to perceive, it's eventually embraced by several other countries, but not to a certain and a strong extent, if you know what I mean. For example, in the context of ASEAN, like ASEAN introduced the ASEAN Indo-Pacific AOIP, ASEAN Open Indo-Pacific document. I believe it's 2018 or 19. So because of the norm that the US and allies have introduced when it comes to the context of the Indo-Pacific, they eventually decided to incorporate the open and free Indo-Pacific elements of the US and allies into the document, but they also, facilitated the interests of China using specific careful terms when it comes to the South China Sea and describing the tensions there. So yes, it does have several impact, but again, ASEAN's AOIP doesn't really make too much differences, right? Too much different. The only impact from what I see that ASEAN's document eventually created is that um, it was able to create concrete cooperation through the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Forum. But besides the normative level that we need to do peace, freedom of navigation, whatnot, those are the type of norms that has been there for decades long. So significant wise, not really much. So even with the document, like Joe Biden's term, I don't feel that um, there was a strategy, a policy implementation of a strategy in the Pacific that really created a difference when it comes to China's exertion of influence. So does China take into consideration? Most probably yes, but I think that China is more concerned with what happens on the ground. So on the ground, what they're facing are Indonesia's coast guards, Philippines coast guard, Vietnam's coast guard, and the Southeast Asian states' fisheries surveillance vessels. Right? It's not the U.S. Over there. Besides the international waters, probably in the Pacific, but because the South China Sea is the central hotspot when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, then the US is not really there. It just depends on the Southeast Asian states, what they can do, what they do, and that's what becomes the concern for China. So the US, I would say, hasn't really done that much besides trying to introduce the same norms that they did a couple of decades ago, 2 decades ago. So one pillar emphasized advancing the sixth question, advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific, which includes strengthening democratic institutions, support for openness and freedom of maritime access in accordance with international. What is your assessment of the effectiveness of U.S. influence? Okay, so strengthening democratic institutions, the rule of law and democratic governance, support for openness and freedom of... Not much. I would say not much. So it's very vague. It's very ambiguous with the first pillar. Strengthening democratic institutions, rule of law, and democratic governance. How exactly, I think, is the question with the first pillar, because the one thing that we need to highlight is that Indo-Pacific is not like a small region. Like, it's not the backyard of the US in the Middle East after the 2000 wars of Afghanistan and Iraq. It's a very large area, and unlike the Middle East wars, Indo-Pacific is not vacant of great powers. China is a major great power. It's a considerably great power compared to the powers in the Middle East. So that means that you can't bully yourself to do whatever you want and achieve the things that you want without consequences. So that's why I think that the actions have been severely limited. I really don't understand how the US has been able to strengthen democratic institutions. So perhaps this is where my expertise lies. My expertise lies more on the Chinese perspective and the Southeast Asian perspective, not necessarily the US. But I think I would know if, for example, there was a great intervention that was been made when it comes to the rule of law and democratic institutions, which I don't feel that there is much of a difference besides the traditional US aid agencies, the NGOs that is affiliated with the US government that tries to help out with the rule of law and also democratic institutions. So, but no major breakthroughs. I mean, I don't want you to, in my perspective, it's not a place where you're able to implement democratic rule and law. Like Southeast Asia, for example, at the center of the Indo-Pacific, it's not the most democratic area. You got even authoritarian monarch systems. You got systems where you have Brunei, you have a sultan, you have Myanmar that doesn't really have a strong power. You have coups taking place like almost yearly in Thailand. You got Hun Sen to Hun Manet in Cambodia. The family monarchy system. So those systems has been there even before Biden, even before any Indo-Pacific declaration. So I would say that the first pillar has not really been implemented effectively, considering that most of the systems in the Indo-Pacific hasn't seen great changes with respect to democratic governance. Now, support for openness and freedom of maritime access. Besides the presence of the US fleets in international waters, I think that the big question is on the hotspot areas, regional hotspot areas, like, for example, South China Sea. Because of the presence of these, maritime constabulary forces, it does affect shipping routes, in those areas. And I don't believe that the US influence has been any significant in helping out those cases. One thing to point maybe that can be explored by the researcher is the US role in non-traditional security threats. So, for example, in tackling um, IUUF, so illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, maritime terrorism, drug trafficking. Maybe there is a strong coordination that the US has with their allies in Southeast Asia and other Indo-Pacific region to tackle those particular cases. But in the more traditional sense of maritime disputes, I don't believe that they have that much of a say, especially in the pillars that you mentioned. These two pillars about democratic institutions and also freedom of maritime access. I would say absolutely like 10% of the influence that China has exerted. Okay, so number 7 is another pillar is forging connections within and beyond the region, where the US aims to strengthen alliances and cooperation with international organizations. Is the Indo-Pacific. Sorry, another pillar is forging connections within and beyond the region, where the US aims to strengthen alliances and cooperation with international organizations in the Pacific and deepen bilateral relations with allied nations. How is the US approach incorporated with ASEAN as international South China Sea region? Well, not much. In the 7th question, not much. And the reason for this is that, US is only a... Wait. Okay, so US is only a dialogue partner with many of ASEAN's institutions. So when dialogue partners, for example, with the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, the +1, ASEAN +1, ASEAN Plus mechanisms, you would see the US there as one of the actors. But you won't see them as having the big capacity to influence. In regards to the Indo-Pacific, I say that the ASEAN Open Indo-Pacific document has, for example, to a certain extent, provided that that norm that free and open Indo-Pacific is necessary. But yeah, again, we need to argue, and I think that a lot of scholars have mentioned this about how significant is ASEAN's documents when they issue one. All of these documents are more like a toothless dinosaur where, ASEAN is so big and involves so many countries, but, it lacks the teeth, it lacks the ability and the capacity to create change. And even I argued that in a couple of articles. So I think that the problem is in ASEAN itself. And because ASEAN is so respectful towards all different opinions, they can't really, counter a country, especially like China, when it comes to the South China Sea, because basically they're not mandated to manage the tensions outside of the realms of the declaration of and code of conduct. So, it has. If the question is has, the U.S. approach, yes, and to a certain extent, it has succeeded in introducing new norms. But again, we need to argue the significance of these norms, and eventually creating any changes when it comes to the context of the South China Sea, which I believe does not create any changes at all. Let me take an example. For example, the Declaration of Code of Conduct in 2002. If it really did create a change, China would be hesitant to apply all these grey zone tactics of using coast guards and whatnot in maritime disputed waters. But they're not. The reality is that they have not, and I think that this isn't an assumption. Like think tanks like the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative, or in Indonesia they have Indonesia Open Justice Initiative or something like that. Now, these think tanks use automatic intelligence systems to track the presence of these Chinese coast guards and also other coast guards in Southeast Asia, and I think that resulted to a clear conclusion that China has always been present, even though there is all of these declarations from ASEAN or even the International Law Arbitral Tribunal that have not slowed down their pace in the South China Sea. And it actually shows the weaknesses of ASEAN in regards to the South China Sea. Okay, the pillar, bolstering Indo-Pacific security, reflects the U.S. commitment to providing security assistance to allies against aggression and coercion, preventing cyber threats, and offering military assistance such as military autonomy. What is your analysis of the impact of U.S. security assistance? Not much. I would say that this doesn't fall in my expertise. I'm not sure about the significance. Now, I can say, for example, I read this article about the Philippines when it was Duterte's term in 2001, I think 2002. Duterte in the Philippines was more of a decisive actor when it comes to the South China Sea. He kind of downplayed the South China Sea because he wanted to get money from the Belt Road Initiative, but because that didn't transpire, eventually he kind of like became more assertive when it comes to the South China Sea. Um, During that period, there was a lot of talk, exactly like your eighth question. The U.S. would be more present in allies of the Southeast Asian region, including Philippines, that would provide assistance. And I can't say for sure whether those assistances took place in reality or in ground or in practical reality. But I can say that the discourse does matter. But again, it doesn't really make a difference when it's South China Sea. I think that the conclusion here with all your questions is that despite whatever rhetoric and discourses and norms that the US is willing to promote when it comes to South China Sea, what eventually matters with those disputed waters is what you actually do in those waters. So, for example, with China really clearly tries to make sure that they are present in those seas using maritime constabulary forces, and I think that that's the big point and big takeaway in this particular context. So I think that's all. Thank you very much, and good luck with the research.